Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Broughton, your host. Today we have back with us Dave Petersen. He is the pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He is also a departmental editor for Gottesdienst, the Journal of Lutheran Liturgy, with his recurring column Commentary on the War. Welcome back, Dave.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So before we get into the topic today, I have my usual plea for funds. But first, thank you to all who have given and who do support the podcast and the ongoing work of Gottesdienst through Patreon. If you do enjoy what you are hearing, as well as what you're reading on the blog or in the journal, for as little as $1 a month, you can be a patron. So go to patreon.com/Gottesdienst and help us out. All right. So the reason I wanted to chat with you today is you had written a blog post, I want to say a couple weeks ago, on a preaching renewal. And this seems like something that comes up almost biannually within the Missouri Synod, that somehow we need to have a preaching renewal. Some people agree, some people don't. Why do you think we need it?
Well, because I don't think our preaching's that good. I mean, I think that we become very complacent in our preaching, and it's easy to sort of be bad at it and not to put in the effort that it really is necessary and that reverence demands, and to sort of get away with it because, the people are pretty tolerant.
So what do you see as being the renewal then for our preaching?
Well, I think so. I would just back it up a step. I would say that first of all, we need to recognize what the sermon is and the role that the sermon plays in the service. Because the reason the reason I think Gottesdienst is so interested in preaching is because it recognizes the unity of the divine service and the highlights of the divine service, depending on how you sort of frame it. It's either the words of institution or the reading of the Holy Gospel and the words of institution. That's the sort of objective means, or the sermon and the distribution, because really the sermon is the way that the gospel or the lessons of the day, but the gospel primarily, are applied to the people, and the distribution is the way that the body and blood are applied to the people. So the sermon really needs to be held up as this kind of high point and the sort of one of the central realities that's happening and the reason that people are coming to church. So I think sometimes, I think there's lots of things that go wrong, and lots of ways we get lazy, but we sometimes get this idea that the sermon's just sort of this necessary thing that we have to go through the motions of, or we don't recognize the power that God has given to the proclaimed word as a divine institution that is really very parallel to holy baptism, holy communion. Melanchthon says, look, if you want to call ordination a sacrament, if you mean preaching, then okay. I mean, that's pretty astounding that Luther gives it that kind of praise. But I think because, we've all been bored in sermons and we've all wished they were shorter or whatever, it kind of gets short shrift. And then I think a couple of things have happened. So it doesn't have the kind of high point. People often don't sort of anticipate hearing the sermon with eagerness, the way that they might, for example, to receive the Lord's Supper. They also might get the idea that they could receive a sermon through digits, over the internet without being in place physically, which I also, you can receive some of the benefit from it, but it's not the same because it is an incarnational reality. God puts human beings, men, into the office of the ministry for the sake of preaching to other men. So there is a physical reality to it. So anyway,
there's a time and place to it. Right?
Yeah. So all of that we forget.
Okay. So Gottesdienst has throughout the years kind of noticed that our preaching today sounds different than the preaching of our forefathers, whether that's Luther himself or Gerhard or Walther. I mean, not to get into like all the specifics, but what are the differences or what's going on in our time versus their time?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. For one thing, we got this idea that the sermon is merely performative speech and that it's an absolution. And so there's been this kind of extreme distinction between law and gospel that has denigrated the law, maybe not intentionally, but it has, and certainly has denigrated, because things like categories are of the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing that kind of stuff, so any sort of teaching of doctrine, well, that's all the law. And we want to preach the gospel, right? People need the gospel. So there's been the law gospel thing, and the sort of antinomian problems have affected it. Mm-hmm. But also I think just the fact, again, that we have sort of bowed to the pressure of the people, that it's the sermon's job to hold their attention and to, make it interesting in such a way that, they'll connect with it. And all the work's sort of put on the preacher. Mm-hmm. And then the dictates of the people drive the preacher's work. It's his job to amuse them. So, I think those are the kind of two overarching problems, along with a general cowardice, right? So, we're living in the thick of it right now. This kind of extreme thing where, when you come to church, you shouldn't expect the sermon to talk about religion or politics, right? Because those things are both offensive. So the sermon's going to keep it very kind of light, very innocuous. And, it's going to preach sermons that could be basically preached in any church. They're not distinctively Lutheran because they're not really dogmatic, and they're not defined by our dogmatic categories and our, confessions. Mm-hmm. So I think all of that kind of plays together in the modern phenomena, and it's happened to us kind of unawares.
So what's the way back then? What does a preacher need to do in order to kind of shed that skin of clothing to get back to what it ought to be?
Well, I think the first thing we got to do is we've got to actually conceive what the ideal is. So this is sort of my idea here. Well, this isn't my idea, but that, the service has these two high points, mm-hmm. and people ought to be taught, in confirmation, in Bible class, and in preaching, which is the main place teaching takes place. They ought to be taught that they should prepare for Holy Communion, right? That they should mm-hmm. They shouldn't take it lightly. They should pray before, they should think about it the night before, they should repent, they should pray, they should fast, they should come to confession, right? Holy mm-hmm. Communion shouldn't be taken lightly or for granted. And in a similar way, then, they ought to also prepare for the sermon. That is, that they ought to be interested in what the preacher is going to preach on before they come. So read the texts, right, for that assigned for that Sunday. They ought to know what the church year is, and where they are in the church year. They ought to know the ceremonies and all the things that go together there. And they ought to know really the Lutheran chorales that are associated with each Sunday. Ideally, they know these by heart. So there would be real preparation so that they're ready to hear the sermon. And then the other side of this is that I don't think the sermon should be kind of a one-time event that's performed on Sunday and forgotten even before the benediction. But there should be enough in this sermon, and the people should try to find something in the sermon that they would talk about it on the way home. They'd talk about it at Sunday dinner.
Yeah, I've talked with my folks often, this is the divine service, hearing God's word preached. That's when you're getting everything packed up, right, within you. And you've got to have time around the family table in order to unpack it. And you need to do that, right? Because you're not going to be able to get it all in one sitting. You need time to kind of chew on it.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. No, I think that's exactly right. They need to make an investment in this, even as the preachers are. And, that means preparation and then afterwards review, right? And mm-hmm. rehearsing it with one another, talking about it, thinking about it, And I think then, that goes along with that is that we ought to really be publishing our sermons in some format for our people so that they could take them home, so they could mail them to their friends. I mean, and that sort of thing. And that really, by the way, is not really much different than what it was in Wittenberg when Luther was preaching in St. Mary's.
Mm-hmm.
They did print these sermons, and people, it was a kind of, it looks like from our perspective, a kind of entertainment for them.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like that because they don't have anything that's entertaining the way we do. So I don't think they would have called it entertainment. They were working it. It was enjoyable for them. But anyway, I think that's what we got to try to strive for, is to get back, to elevate it back up to this thing. And then if we can sort of say, well, that's the goal, that the sermon's this high point, then I think we can talk about, how do we actually move toward that goal?
Yeah, I wonder if, they wouldn't have thought, that is, the people of Wittenberg wouldn't have thought that it is entertainment. It's just that our view of entertainment has become so skewed to being, just emotive or striking our emotions, or, getting us to these particular highs or lows, instead of something that is entertaining in the way that even doing hard, difficult work can be entertaining. That is not just occupying our time, but allowing us to make use of all the gifts that God has given us in our brains and in our bodies, and that in the end, despite the work that it might have entailed, is still joyful.
Right. Yeah, I would say it's so. The problem is that in our context, I think entertainment is mostly passive.
Mm-hmm.
Right. These are things we watch happen, and it's just in our brains. So television as the kind of primal example.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what we're talking about, is something more like conversation. Conversations can be fun.
Yes.
And so it's right. It's not that it's not enjoyable, but and you're probably right. They would have spoke of it. I think they would have spoken of it, what they were doing and the way they were engaging with this, much in the way that people speak with, kind of a passion about their hobbies. But they just didn't have the time for amusement or the luxuries that we do. So it is a kind of a different world. But, again, you could even go to a secular example, like, the Greeks with their philosophy, Socrates, running around Athens, bugging everybody. There was
the Stoics and yeah.
So, that is a kind of an interesting phenomena of a sort of intellectual pursuit that was rewarding. I guess that's why I'm struggling. I don't want to call it entertainment, because it seems to me what Socrates was doing is far different than, watching the Muppets.
Yeah, I'd agree. Obviously our understanding of entertainment has skewed that to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, they did have some of that. They had puppet shows. They did have some stuff like that, people that came by, but it was always, I'm no expert on this, but I think it was always kind of bawdry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they did. So,
well, either that or just, if you think of the tragedies or the plays, they were either bawdry or extremely political.
Yeah, but now if you're talking about the Greek plays, they did have more of an educational purpose, though.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, we've gone afield, I think.
Sure.
We better get back.
So, all right, so that's the issue. And that's the ideal, that we would view the sermon not simply as a stepping stone to Holy Communion or the distribution, but as a twin high point to that.
Yeah, and we should have said too, and not just another absolution.
Okay.
Right? It's distinct from the absolution. So, even though, the absolution delivers the forgiveness of sins, and Holy Communion delivers the forgiveness of sins, and baptism and preaching, they all do it distinctly. They're not interchangeable. And sometimes we've spoken about the sermon as though its only purpose was to proclaim the gospel for the forgiveness of sins, directly into the ears of the people. And, and we've talked about this on here before, but in the Book of Concord, the word teaching means preaching.
Mm-hmm.
The only place you can teach doctrine, I think that Bible class is not for teaching doctrine. So I think this is another place where our modern day pastors have gone way astray. There's no Bible classes in Wittenberg. There's no Bible classes in the Bible, right? That's a totally modern idea. And this thinking that being disappointed and upset because the people don't come to Bible class. I mean, yeah, of course, it'd be great if they came to Bible class, and we should make the most of that opportunity. But that's not a place to teach doctrine. You've got to teach doctrine from the pulpit. I think the purpose of Bible class is to teach how to read the Bible. You're not there. I mean, now you're going to teach some doctrine there because there's going to be examples and you're going to be going through the Bible. But I think we ought to, when you talk about, well, how are you going to teach your people this, whatever it is, moving the communion age to a more Christian age, like 5 or 6 instead of 13, going to every Sunday communion, people coming to private confession and absolution, having good ceremonies that actually uphold all of our doctrine. That's all got to be done in the pulpit. You can't do that in Bible class. It's not the right venue because you don't have everybody there, and you need to do it in the pulpit. So anyway, right, the twin peak, and to recognize the unique gift that God has instituted in the sermon and what he promises to do through it, and then to use it appropriately.
All right. So then how do we get back there? How do we get to that ideal? What are the things that we then need to concentrate on?
I think, first of all, again, we need to think about that whole what is the sermon thing, and what is the preacher, and what is the office in which we're serving. So, we've often pointed out that, Article 5 of the Augsburg Confession is the preaching office. Mm-hmm. This is the definitive thing, really, that we're doing. And we ought to come to it with a certain kind of sobriety and see ourselves as prophets. And I really think, we're much closer, in a sense, to the kind of the way that the prophets worked in the Old Testament than we are to the apostles, because the apostles were going out to pagan lands, right, and proclaiming the gospel to people who'd never heard it before.
Yeah,
that's great. That's a great work if you can get it, but where are you going to go today, right? Especially if they've at least heard of it. We're much more in the case of, Isaiah, when everybody's supposed to be in the club, but they're not, almost nobody is, right? And they don't know they're not. So I really think we've got to kind of take up this role of calling the people to repentance, calling them back to faithfulness, holding them accountable, and being courageous about it. And I think, the other thing that kind of is difficult for us is that we have this, the Missouri Synod, at least, I think, has this kind of Midwest humility that, we don't want to act too proud. But it's not pride. It's not pride. It's if you debase the office that God has created, that's the opposite of pride. That's a sin also. So we need to be appropriate. We need to speak appropriately, and we need to speak with authority. That, look, these are the things that are true. Thus says the Lord. We're not just up here, giving you opinions and little life hacks, but we're actually preaching doctrine, and we're preaching it. Thus says the Lord.
So, in other words, getting comfortable with the authority that has been granted the office that you fill.
Yeah, and not apologizing for it, being ashamed of it, and pretending like you're just one of the boys, because you're not. And so you've got to do this, and that will help, I think, give the appropriate weight to yourself and to what you're saying, and the people will pick up on it. To recognize too, to be comfortable not only with the authority, but to be comfortable with the crosses that are going to come with that. Because, of course, part of the reason we don't say everything we should say is because we're afraid of what the people will think. And I always think about, I remember I went to a wedding of a relative of mine at an ELCA church, and the pastor stood up and preached about Adam and Eve at the wedding, and he preached the whole thing as an allegory, and it all sounded very good. Like none of the Missouri Synod people there were, in fact, they were caught off guard. They're like, wow, we believe everything he said. No, well, we didn't really, right? Because he didn't really admit what he believes. Mm-hmm. So he just avoided the controversial stuff, like the fact that he doesn't think Adam and Eve are real people. And he just makes all these sort of spiritual lessons out of it. And that's how it worked in the late 60s and 70s in the Missouri Synod too. You could sort of just not talk about the details that were uncomfortable or where you knew the disagreement was. Well, that's precisely where we need to talk, where we know the disagreement is, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, this is the kind of, if we're going to do that, that is a kind of prophetic voice. And you pointed out, you sent to me this blog from DougWills.com, where he talks about this, the prophets speaking in the present tense, as opposed to simply telling what's going to happen in the future. They're actually interpreting the present.
Right.
And we can sort of sometimes forget that aspect and pretend like we're just preaching about the Bible, or again, we're just preaching the gospel. So I think the authority and then the kind of willingness to take the hits and to suffer for this. I don't mean, of course, that we go looking for it or that we're, offensive on purpose, but the Word of God is confrontational. And I mean, it's almost sort of as if no one's ever, been upset at what you taught in your sermon, maybe it's because you've never taught anything.
Oh. Yeah, there is a strain we see this in our Lord. Like, he's speaking to the Sadducees, and the first thing he brings up is the resurrection, right? Because he knows that they disagree with it.
Yeah, right. He's not going to just, this is always this thing about, we agree more than we disagree. Why don't we ever talk about what unites us? Well, that's insane, Right. I remember John Pless saying one time, complaining about that and saying, that's like saying that airplanes and cars have more in common than discommon, And it's like, well, in some sense, they're both vehicles, they carry people, they move, but they're obviously quite a bit distinct, and the distinctions are important.
So getting comfortable with that authority, and then also, it seems, believing in what the Bible actually says, right? That you're not uncomfortable or ashamed of what the Bible's saying, because you'll avoid speaking about those things. I mean, it sounds like that's what you're describing with regard to the ELCA wedding sermon. Right.
No, I think we've all done it, but right, we ought to be ashamed of our shame, is what I tell people. We are ashamed of the Bible in our fallen flesh and the things that are uncomfortable for us, our current day. But we ought to be ashamed of that, and for that reason, we ought to talk about these things.
Yeah, and if we are, delve into studying it more, right? That you have a better grasp of what those things are, instead of just staying in, your safe arenas.
Right.
All right. So the first thing is the understanding of who we are, that we're in the preaching office and being comfortable with the authority granted to it. What's next?
I think the next thing is that we have to learn how to read. So, so before we can have a preaching renewal, we need to really become much better exegetes. And the way to become a better exegete is to become a better reader. And I know this sounds like, what? Everybody knows how to read. We read all the time. We don't, actually. We quit reading about 30 years ago, maybe longer. Neil Postman documents it brilliantly. That's still a great book for this. So what's happened is we now skim things, or we read lightly for information rather than reading deeply. And I mean, there's just so much evidence on this, and there's so many books that have been written about this now, and nobody ever comes out and says, watching television or using the internet makes you smarter. It doesn't. You cannot read. Reading a web page, even if it's a book on a web page, is not the same thing as reading a book, because the media impacts the way you receive it and the way your brain processes it. And there's just too many distractions, too many things blinking, too many ads, too many hyperlinks. Every time there's varying data in front of you, you have to make a decision, and that wears your cognitive ability out, and it makes it so you can't actually pay attention to what you're trying to read. So we got to get away from that, and we've just got to admit it and recognize it as this terrible, horrible thing that has happened to us. And I mean, that's actually the first step, is the most important, just to sort of recognize, okay, it's hard for me to concentrate. I'm distracted. I don't read deeply. I'm trying to write a sermon, and I got to write a sermon on this text, and I'm not trying to really contemplate this text. I'm trying to squeeze something out of it for a sermon as quick as I can, so that I can quit working and go back to having fun. And that's the wrong way, right?
Right.
But what we need to do is really read the Bible and let the Bible speak, and we need to take the time with it. So I should say, I should have said this earlier, I don't think that the way for preaching renewal, there's no easy way. I mean, I think the short answer is work harder. Well, which I know, people don't like hearing because we want to hear, here's
work
life
smarter.
hacks. Yeah, work smarter. Right. I'm saying don't work smarter because it's not smarter. It's actually dumber and you don't know it. So work slower and more deliberately and take the time that it takes. So I think probably the easiest, the most accessible and quickest book on this is this Why Johnny Can't Preach by T. David Gordon. It's a great book. It's basically, Neil Postman for preachers. And he goes through it. He teaches at Grove City College. He's a media ecologist. And he just shows how the problem is that the preachers can't preach because they don't have anything to preach about, because they don't know the Bible well enough, because they haven't internalized it and they haven't read it deeply. So I think we've got to do, along with that, read that book. It's only about 100 pages. It's well worth it. We need to do some things to discipline ourselves to spend less time with screens. I use Logos and I love it because it's so great. But I have, in the last couple of months now, I'm back to using a paper Bible to write sermons. And I know you've been on this for a long time. I don't do this that much, but I do a little bit. Writing things out by longhand, right?
Yeah, I still do that.
Yeah.
And then I type it up, but
yeah, right. But all of these books will talk about that and say, like, that's the best thing you can do if you're actually trying to remember something or process it. So we got to go back to some of these kind of analog things, and we need to put strategies and techniques and so forth in place to limit our screen time and how we use them and what we do with them. So another great book, classic, is this Nicholas Carr, The Shallows.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a great book too. It's depressing in some ways because, it's just how dumb we are and how TV and stuff has ruined us. But there's a great thing in there. He talks about these studies about multimedia presentations and how effective they are. So there's this study where, I'm doing this from memory, so I may not get all the details exactly right, but the end is the same. It's some country in Africa, and they give it the presentation to two different groups of people. And one of them, they open up a web browser and it's just pages of text. So that's all they've got. And they just read, I don't know how many pages about this country in Africa. And then some small country, Mali maybe. And then the other group gets a full-blown TED Talk style multimedia presentation with graphs and videos and music and animation. But it's all the same material. And then at the end of it, they try to test to see, well, how did it come out? And what it comes out is that the people that had the multimedia thing, they thought it was a good presentation, but they don't remember any facts from it. They don't find the topic itself, this country, interesting in any way. But the presentation was good, but it was completely ineffective. And then they take the people that read it, they think that, the presentation was boring, but the topic's actually very interesting. And they retained a whole bunch of information on it, and that they can reproduce. And so what it turns out is it's back to that sort of multimedia stuff. When there's too much going on, there's too many decisions to make, there's too much to look at, we can't actually process it. And so you like it because you weren't bored during it, because you were being amused. You don't like it because you actually lurked. The other people didn't necessarily enjoy the presentation, but because it was boring, but it actually did its purpose, right? Yeah. So working at something actually is better for us. So I know this just sounds so counterintuitive, but it's like, really the best teachers are the ones who bore their students. And, and that's probably true also of preachers. That really, this whole multimedia thing is a crock, and it's not worth it. It doesn't actually work. All it does, of course, the students are clamoring for it because they don't like to be bored and they don't like to work. They would much rather be entertained. I was going to say something else about that, and it just slipped out of my mind. Speaking of distracted, well, anyway, Yeah, I quit using because of that. I don't use any PowerPoint or anything in Bible class anymore. I think it's way off. Oh, I know what I was going to say. There's this other thing, and this comes up almost every time I go to a pastor's conference and talk about preaching. Somebody brings up this thing about learning styles, which there is no such thing. So there's this fantasy that has no. There's research on this, but it all says it's not true. This idea that some people are visual learners and some people are hands-on and some people are auditory, right?
Right.
So this is a persistent myth that is largely believed by teachers, school teachers, educators.
Mm-hmm.
And even though, the psychologists don't believe in it because they've proven it. So again, people say, well, for example, in the sermon, they'll say, well, I'm a visual learner. That's why I have a hard time listening during a sermon. You're not a visual learner. There are no visual learners. You could learn through this. You just have to work at it, and you don't want to. So we have to kind of come clean on that. There's a ton of information out there about how that thing's bogus, but that's the sort of, justification for bringing screens into church. Mm-hmm. Well, if the purpose of church is to actually, feed people and have the gospel change them and have it take effect in their life, the worst thing you can do about it is to do screens. So, and I'm not saying that there's never an illustrated book or, an illustration of what the book's talking about at various times, of course, can be very helpful, to get the point across and to help us understand what's being said. But we're not talking about an illustrated book. We're talking about multimedia stuff. And that's not the same thing. So anyway, the learning style thing's fake. Our ability to multitask is fake. The benefits of multimedia are fake. And we're all products of it. So we have to relearn how to read and to read deeply and purposefully, not to skim for information.
So it's been a long time since I read Why Johnny Can't Preach. Does he give you the way to get back to reading rightly?
Yeah, he at least sets you on the right path, right? That you need to just start reading, and you need to read from real books, not on screens. And I really do think, actually, I know I'm harping on it, but I actually think this is the most important step, to just sort of recognize that we're not reading well, and it's going to require effort, and we're going to have to suffer some and do some work.
Yeah.
Because that's once you sort of know that and you're willing to do it, you really, in some sense, it's not that hard anymore. Now you can just okay, I know what I got to do. It's going to keep on being hard, but it's not like there's no tricks.
Right.
Right. And of course, I always give this story of, I can remember, being a private waiting for basic training to start. It was just horrible. You go down to the processing station and you wait till they have enough kids to throw in a platoon, and you got drill sergeants running around, but you're just standing in lines all day. It's like the worst possible existence that I can imagine. And you're scared to death waiting for it to start. Mm-hmm. And you're bored, your head's shaved, and there, anyway, so you got all this time with all these other privates who don't know anything, and the rumor mill and all of the sort of stuff that goes on where these guys are telling you what they think they know about what basic training is going to hold and what you need to do to make it easier. We're going to come to the obstacle course, and my buddy told me, take a right, not a left, and all of this kind of stuff. And they're just desperate for some way to make it easier. And it's ridiculous. You can't make it easier.
Yeah, there's no way.
You're not going to outgame the drill sergeants and not have to do push-ups. They don't care. You're going to do them. But it's like so much of life is like that. That's why there's all these diets. Right? Mm-hmm. How can I look, we all know take in less calories, burn more, period. That's it. Secret solved, send me $100. But the problem is we don't want to do that because that's really hard.
Right.
And I think, this is a similar sort of thing.
So basically you're Bob Newhart right now.
Yeah, that's right. Stop it.
Well, so I want to go back to this reading thing just a little bit more. I had read a book by Gene Veith. It's called Reading Between the Lines. And so he goes into some of these same issues, right, about reading. And it's kind of come to, I don't know, what I see when I'm talking with my parishioners is this same kind of thing, that they've forgotten how to read. and you have to read in between the lines for them. You have to fill out the account, or, why did they respond this way? Why did Jesus then respond that way? I mean, you actually have to sit down and think about the interactions between the people and what are the possibilities. And when you do that, it seems as though they're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. What are the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're reading the scriptures to help us read between the lines?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's like, and it's way harder to do this, by the way, with ancient literature than it is modern.
Right.
So modern literature gives you a lot of helps. He turned, he smiled, and he said, whereas like in the Psalms and many places in the Old Testament, the speaker can change. David's talking, now God's talking. It never says anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to do it completely by what the words mean and who could be saying them. So anyway, what I think the questions you need to be asking are exactly, they're questions that you would be asking if you were a detective. I mean, it's questions about motive and intent and who benefits. I mean, those are the sorts of things you need to be saying. Why did Jesus say that? Why does he's talking to the Sadducees. Why does he bring up resurrection of all things?
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't he start someplace easy? Or, I think those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. And I'm afraid that maybe we've been trained to not ask those questions because we've been told it's speculation. And so we've been told that, the good, there's this kind of, I could give you a million examples. Well, one of the favorite Lutheran ones, it seems to me, is this one where they jump on the temptation and they say, well, what Eve did wrong was she said that we couldn't even touch the tree, but God didn't say that in chapter 2. He just said, don't eat of it. So she's adding to the word of God.
Mm.
Well, I think that's crazy.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's presented as a factual sort of thing, and God told them more than is recorded there, and Adam might have added it as a ceremony or as a discipline as the preacher. I mean, but there's this like kind of extreme wooden literalism, because if you say anything else, then you're speculating. I'm speculating that God said more than is actually written in the Bible. I'm speculating that Adam actually talked to Eve about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean that part's not speculative, right? And I think so. There's all sorts of these things where it comes up, and we end up with this kind of strange thing. So I was going to do this in the next part, but there's Debra Tannen is a retired linguist from Georgetown who has written a number of very popular books about conversations and how to engage in really discourse analysis. So how to understand this. And I just love her stuff. And I think pick up any of her books about conversations. He's got, I think there's one called He Said, She Said. There's one called Workplace Conversations. There's one about daughters and mothers. They're all great. And so there's all of this stuff that she teaches when she sees what's happening. So there's a lot that happens, for example, and we're masters of this in our own speech with indirect discourse or indirect speech. Mm-hmm. So the example she always uses is the general walks in the room, right? And he says, it's cold in here. And then he never tells anybody to do anything, never asks anybody to do anything. But he means do something about this, right? Yeah. And they know it, and they jump. And so we do this all the time. Another example would be, if I call your house and Lauren answers the phone and I say, is Jason there? She doesn't say, yep, he's in the other room. She knows what I mean, right? I'm not being manipulative when I say, is Jason there? I'm saying I want to talk to him. And it's not some sort of, manipulation thing. That's just the way language works. Only a child without any experience would just, kind of answer the question woodenly and assume that was the purpose of the phone call, just to find out if Jason was there, right? So we use this kind of speech all the time. Well, it's also a lot of this kind of speech in the Bible, and it goes over our heads. And I mean, a great example of this is the sixth petition, lead us not into temptation. Right? What does that mean? It doesn't mean lead us not into temptation. First of all, God doesn't even tempt anybody. Second of all, we know we're going to be tested. We're going to be tested. There's going to be trials and hardships, right?
Yeah.
So when we say, do not lead us not into temptation, it's very parallel to Jesus saying, take this cup from me. What do you mean? You can't take the cup from him. It's necessary he does that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's really going on when Jesus says, if it's possible, take this cup from me, is he's saying, look, I'm about to go into this, and I need some reassurance and some comfort that you're going to be on the other side of this, and that what I'm doing is good and right.
Yeah.
Right? This is a conversation between a father and a son, and it's an engagement of some indirect speech. And when we say lead us not into temptation, that's what we're doing. We're saying, look, we know you're going to do this to us. We know that we have to go through these things. But if we have to go through them, we want to promise that you're going to be there for us, that you're going to see us through, right? Although we are attacked by these things, we pray that we may finally overcome them and win the victory.
Yeah.
And that's, it's hilarious in a way that, like, right in the Lord's Prayer, right in the prayers of Jesus, we have this kind of speech, but we struggle to talk about it or really to recognize it, and it sends people into a tizzy. A similar sort of thing would be the hyperboles that Jesus uses, right? Call no man father. He doesn't mean at all call no man father. We should call lots of people father, right?
Right.
What we shouldn't do is we shouldn't mistake God's agents, for God himself, but we should recognize these are God's masks, and these are the way that he takes care of us, but we shouldn't worship our earthly fathers. Right. That's what he means. He doesn't actually mean don't call them father. Of course, call them father. Right?
Right.
So, but you get into this like craziness because there's this idea that we're somehow being biblical, and we're going just by the text, but we're not actually going by the actual meaning of the text. I mean, the real literal meaning of call no man father is not call no man father. The real literal meaning is don't mistake the masks of God for God.
Right.
So there's all kinds of this, and we fall into this sort of all the time. I think Debra Tannen is really a good guide to help us understand the way language works, conversations work, and to see some of these things. But so anyway, I think you got to be willing to. I haven't read the Veith book. I wasn't even aware of it. I just read an essay about Neil Postman and his influence on the evangelicals, and it brought up Ed Veith in that, and that particular book, and how reliant upon it he. I mean, it was a positive thing. It was an essay about how much Neil Postman, a secular Jew, has influenced and been important to evangelical Christians. So I'm going to try to get a copy of it.
Of Veith's book?
I actually have put it on hold at the library just like 2 days ago.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I can't, it was a long time ago since I've read it. And so I don't remember all the ins and outs, but I remember that basic gist. So it seems like what you're talking about here is we've come to the point where, just like really anything else in our culture, we have begun to treat the things of God scientifically, like it's a science.
Yeah, that's right. There's this other kind of funny thing, and this is Andrew Luth gets at this in a book called Discerning the Mystery, and another book that's similar and makes a similar argument from Paul Scott Wilson, a book called God Sense, like common sense, S-E-N-S-E.
Yeah.
And both of those recognize this kind of terrible thing that we're still being defined by higher criticism. So here's the funny thing is that what is the question of higher criticism? What happened, right? What's the historical reality? Mm-hmm. And of course, the higher critics, for the most part, none of it happened, right?
Right.
But for us, it's like we've let that question determine how we read the text, as though the only thing that the text is doing us is telling us what happened, right? Mm-hmm. And so, Luth would argue, we've lost the allegorical scent. He's an Eastern Orthodox guy, and so he wants to bring us back to allegory. And he goes a little too far in there, kind of from our point of view, of course. But Paul Scott Wilson is a Calvinist, a liberal Calvinist, but and he also advocates for kind of an allegorical use. Mm-hmm. And I think he's right. Wilson goes through, it's really a good book. He goes through the fourfold medieval interpretation scheme, And he basically demonstrates that what I took away from seminary about it is not accurate. Maybe it's not what I was taught. Maybe I misunderstood it, but it might be what I was taught, Yeah. And then Wilson goes through, look, he says, all Christian preachers are basically doing this. You are allegorizing a lot in your sermons, and you just don't know that's what you're doing. It would be better if you actually realized that's what you were doing. So, if you're preaching on the healing of the 10 lepers, and you speak about, the leprosy of sin that we need to be cleansed from, that's allegory.
Right.
And, we're doing that all the time. And he makes this argument, that's why he calls it the God sense of Scripture. He really means kind of the theological sense or the spiritual meaning in Scripture.
So with regard to allegory, Heath Curtis actually has a really great paper on this.
Oh, I didn't know it.
Where he goes through, first of all, allegory in the ancient world, right? So when it pops up in Homer and when people are kind of saying that we shouldn't read Homer because he speaks ill of the gods, he follows this through this understanding from Heraclitus on the use of allegory is there in order to hide something from one person in order to reveal it to another person. So on the face of it, it's saying one thing, but underneath it, it's saying something else. And so he brings this up with regard to all of Jesus's parables, right? So,
yeah.
And he uses the Good Samaritan as kind of like the test case, that on the one hand, he tells this parable because of the lawyer in such a way that he's left only with the law. But the one who has ears to hear, right, the Christian, can see that this is precisely what Jesus is doing in coming to earth, that he is the Good Samaritan. So you have this allegory there that it's hiding something from one person, but revealing it to someone else who actually knows what's going on.
Right. I mean, Jesus says that about the parables explicitly.
Exactly. Well,
right. That hearing they would not hear,
Exactly. And that's precisely why why Curtis says, when we come to the parables, we should allegorize them.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are absolutely literally allegories anyway.
Right.
I mean that if you're not allegorizing on the parables, you're way off. I mean, if you're teaching this as history, Well, so of course we've got to take the parables allegorically. They are allegories.
His point is that there are actually two messages there.
Oh yeah, okay, I agree with that too. That's a good point, right? So there's kind of there's the actual meaning that Jesus is the Good Samaritan, and then there's the sort of way that unbelief will see it as just admonition to do good to your neighbor.
Right.
And right. No, and I think most of the parables, that's pretty obvious that they can be easily misunderstood or misinterpreted. The parable of the soil is they read that as though there are some people that are good and there's other people that aren't, and the good people can be saved, right? Because they're the good soil. So yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. So Wilson's point is a little different than that, and that's that what he would sort of say is just that there is spiritual meaning, and the Holy Spirit means to teach spiritual truths through the history of Israel. And sometimes because of higher criticism, we're stuck on history. So, Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. I mean, that's a factual statement. But then we recognize that the Jordan River is a significant place, and it isn't arbitrary that he was baptized there instead of some other river, and that everything is happening deliberately, and that all of the details none of the details are accidental, or sloppy, but that this is all intended, not some secret code, And I mean, of course, there was some weird stuff in the Middle Ages with allegory, but for the most part, in the Fathers, you don't find really weird stuff. I mean, it's good Christian stuff. And in lots of ways, it's kind of the bad exegetical technique that we were taught as children. We used to sit around in a circle at church, and every kid would read one Bible verse sequentially, and then we'd go back around the circle, and then each kid would say what that verse means to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the best way to do Bible study. It's not the worst way either. I mean, at least you've got them reading the Bible and trying to think how it actually applies to them and what it's saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at least in my experience of that sort of youth Bible study stuff, I mean, I don't remember ever anybody coming up with anything really wacky or weird. I mean, I think they're mostly right about what this means to me. I don't know. I mean, I can't go back in time and revisit them, but there is this kind of, hesitance to, and so I don't know. There's a lot of this I would call all this sort of hermeneutical stuff that just has to do with, we don't know how to read very deeply or very well.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get to the Bible, we get even stupider. So it's hard enough for us to read a book.
Yeah.
But then when we read the Bible, we have these kind of preconceived ideas about orthodoxy and what's allowable. And there's a certain, I think, fear that comes over us that we might get the wrong answer, or that we might, be speculating.
Yeah.
And it prevents us from actually, letting the word have its way with us.
So something I wanted to ask you about with regard to knowing the scriptures better and reading them more deeply, and it's not so much about hermeneutics, but I think just general biblical knowledge. You see often in the New Testament, our Lord, the apostles, and even in a lot of the epistles, the kind of the biblical passage or the texts that teaching is based on comes from the Psalms. Is that because that's what the people knew, and so they went to the wells of scriptural knowledge that the people were familiar with, or is there something else going on there that we're missing?
Oh, that's a good question. From what I've read, the Psalms were not that heavily used in the Old Testament church, not like they are now in the New Testament church. They were used at the temple,
Mm-hmm.
but the idea of like praying through the Psalter once a month. I mean, that's a totally Christian idea. The Christians in the Old Testament didn't do that. This kind of real emphasis comes with the resurrection. So I'm not sure the Psalms were super familiar to the people. I mean, they might have been. I don't know, but I do think that the Psalms, of course, are poetry, and as such, there's imagery there that's vivid and that's meaningful, and there's also rhythm, and there's emotional content.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, those are the things that poetry does for us. So it's easy to remember for various reasons. It's kind of powerful for various reasons. But I think it's important that it's experiential in a way that a history, or prose isn't.
Yeah.
And I think those things are probably why it's so, grabbed so quickly. It could be familiarity, but I mean, and of course, Isaiah is the other one, right? And that's also very poetic.
Mm-hmm.
So it does seem to me that it's, and of course, I mean,
well, it seems to me too, like Isaiah is like a repetition of the Psalms.
Yeah.
I mean,
right. They're closely related. Well, there's now I forgot what I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
Say? That's okay. Probably wasn't.
Well, I mean, you do see a lot of historical events popping up, Paul, and then saying these were written down for your instruction. They happened as an example for them, but they're written down for your instruction. So I get that. I've always been kind of stumped by the Psalms and how prominent they are in New Testament preaching.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's right. It's the Psalms and Isaiah. It's the powerful. Oh, I know. I was going to say it's figurative speech. Poetry it relies heavily upon figures of speech, and again, this is a figure of speech can pack a lot more meaning in fewer words than even cliches can. Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah. I think there's something to be said there too. There's a
So it's like picture language. Is that what you mean? That it draws a picture in your mind?
Well, or a scene, sometimes it's not but right, it calls things to mind that are kind of deeper and bigger than just a few words you would think could convey. If you tried to describe the thing, you'd have to give a whole paragraph. But if you just say, a bird in hand is worth 10, then I get this kind of whole moral backstory about, not wasting what I've got for what I might, and blah, blah, blah. So I think there's just this kind of concision in them that and the concision itself makes them powerful too.
Yeah. I mean, so would you say that it engages the mind of the hearer in a better way than just kind of a narrative event?
I don't know if I'd want to say better. I think that might be, we might be pushing it a little too far. I'd say it does it in a different way. We'd be in trouble if we only had figurative speech, or if we only had poetry. So, it's something that's, again, kind of emotionally impactful, and, you can sort of do it quickly and bring a lot of things and a lot of implications to mind.
So does that inform us at all on our preaching?
We ought to be using Bible passages in our preaching. And for us, it's kind of the whole Bible is poetic, because it is so much, unless you've got a really lousy translation, it is so much more formal and elegant and obviously sort of wisdom sayings that I don't know that for us, a verse from the Psalm is that much more powerful or poetic than a verse from Romans. I think for us, maybe that was true for the people at Jesus' day, but I think for us now, kind of anything from the Bible, to use biblical language throughout and make these kinds of allusions, that it isn't just artful, though it is that. I think it trains the imagination. So that's the other thing with imagination that we didn't talk about. We're talking about, we haven't even used the word yet, I don't think. Nope. But, when we're talking about this kind of deep reading and engaging the imagination, reading between the lines, figuring out who's speaking, where they are, what's just happened, all that stuff, and imagining the scene, the imagination needs to be disciplined and trained. And one of the purposes of preaching is to actually train the imagination of our people, right? We're going to shape the way that they think about God. And, because by default, they're probably going to come in thinking he's an old man with a long white beard in a toga, or whatever, the kind of cultural thing is. So, what we're doing in preaching is articulating the faith for the people and teaching them doctrine, but we're also training their imagination, right? And our own imaginations have to be disciplined and trained as well. And I think that's part of against the sort of charge of speculation, is that we're using imagination that is subservient to reason and that is based upon the text and stays in the text. So there's speculation to some degree. We're not going to be dogmatic about certain things, but at the same time, we're going to recognize that, there's more happening here than is just on the surface.
So your suggestion is to read more. Actual books, in order to. Is there? Do you have some suggestions? And I assume you're meaning fiction books, right? Actual novels.
I wasn't actually, but I think that's important too. I think we need to read. I do think we need to read fiction, and we need to read poetry, modern poetry, or at least not poetry outside the Bible. But I would have been thinking, as we've been talking, I wasn't thinking about that side of things yet. I think that kind of comes later. I think we need to read actually dogmatics books.
You mean to see how they handle the text and what they use? Okay.
Right. And learn how to make a dogma, learn how to use reason to make an argument, and to recognize the arguments that our fathers in the faith have made, that we might kind of grow deeper in this understanding and internalize it so that we could, preach better. So it's sort of like I didn't put this on our outline, but, one of the other things I want to do is, and I said in that blog post, is I think we need to downplay delivery, which it's funny to me how much emphasis is on delivery when like the Missouri Synod, a pastor's conference wants to talk about preaching, or even like in Hom 1 at the seminary, they talk so much about delivery. And I'm thinking, for a Hom 1 student, why are you talking about his hand gestures, and trying to get him to memorize the text so he can preach it, better?
Yeah.
I think these are way out of place at that point. And I guess I feel like as a whole synod, we're not ready for it.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like, before we can get artsy, let's learn the basics. And, I'm thinking we do things like, read the Bible, read the Book of Concord. I know this all sounds, read the Book of Concord, read Gerhardt, read Chemnitz, read Pieper, read these things, and learn how theology is done, and the kind of vocabulary of theology and the categories of theology. And, let's get there first.
Yeah.
And, someday we can fancy it up.
On delivery, I've just finished a book called Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. And it's all about telling stories for like these moth story events. And then even, using these kind of events to be able to tell better stories when you're among your family or your friends or things like that. And so he spends like a half a chapter on delivery, and he says, don't do anything for delivery.
Oh, great.
He says, don't practice in the mirror because you're not looking at yourself. He said, dress as plainly as you can. Don't do anything special. Don't use any props or anything, because as soon as you bring something else in, their attention is focused on that and not on what you're saying. He said,
there you go.
Everything has to be about what you're saying.
I ordered that book the day you sent me the link to it, which was like a month ago, and I haven't got it yet.
Huh.
It's supposed to come by the end of March. I got a 2-month, so I don't know. It must be popular.
It was just back up on the Art of Manliness podcast, so maybe people started.
Well, anyway, I mean, that makes sense to me, what he's saying. I think this has to do some, too, with sort of training your people. I mean, teaching them what a sermon is, and it has the weight that it's supposed to have, and you're not going to do all the work. They need to listen, and, they need to work at listening. It's not your job to hold their attention and to amuse them. But I think, again, that's what they want. That's what we all want in our fallen flesh, right? We don't like to be bored. We would rather be entertained. And so that's what they're pushing for. And I think that's what we're tempted to try to give them.
I think on the whole, most of my people just would prefer that I was less tied to a manuscript.
Yeah, I think,
why? Because then it seems like I'm just talking to them.
Yeah, but you're not just talking to them. You're preaching.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying, I don't think they want to be entertained.
Okay.
I think there's something in it in terms of they want to know that this is from you, not just from your paper.
Okay, that's fair. I agree that it certainly must be genuine, right? And it needs to be true to your own experience,
right?
And faith, right? You're not. I agree with that. And Philip Brooks has that thing about bringing truth through personality. That's what preaching is, and I think that's right, because again, preaching is incarnational, and we can't just send a robot there. You're the man that's called there. So your personality, your experience, that's all important. Even as it is for the writers of the Bible, right? Their personalities come through. So I would agree with that. But at the same time, I think, so this is sort of like my theory on children's sermons. I think the reason people like children's sermons is they like a break from the formality of the service and some cuteness to come in, because they get uncomfortable being in the presence of God for too long. And when children are up there, they feel good about themselves because they're smarter than the children. And, when they're in front of God, they're not. So I think that there's a kind of pressure all the time to sort of break the atmosphere of reverence and to make everybody comfortable. And I think we should try to resist that as much as possible.
Okay.
And I would say, that I don't think that the highest form of speech or the best way to communicate with people is actually through conversations. I know they're the most natural and it's the most comfortable, easiest to listen to.
Yeah.
But I think preaching ought to actually be a formal event. Now, I mean, I wouldn't go out of my way to make it, deliberately stiff or whatever. But
yeah, no, I don't think it's about. Yeah, it's probably a mixed bag. But
yeah,
my
sure.
sense has always been that they feel I don't know, maybe a distance, like I don't know, that it's not incarnational when someone is tied more to a manuscript in their mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think these things can be abused. You can do a really bad reading from a manuscript.
Right.
I mean, so I'm not.
And I probably have.
Yeah, right. I guess I really want to uphold this idea, though, of the sermon being a formal event, in the presence of the king, not two guys in a bass boat picking their noses. And I think that's distinction. We need to work at that. And I think we need to kind of raise everybody's expectation of it. And I'm not trying to, I mean, I when I say, the people, I mean, who is that? That doesn't exist. It's not. But I just mean kind of in general, our culture at large, of the culture of the Missouri Synod at large, not necessarily exact people or even congregations. I just think this is a general thing. And I think we feel it, even if it's never articulated, because we have this idea that, the good preacher is the one who's really somehow dynamic in the pulpit. And I don't think that's really it. It's back to that kind of multimedia presentation where maybe they were amused throughout the whole thing, but they didn't actually learn anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and again, I know if you're overly boring, or being boring for boring's sake, that's not right.
Right. So it seems like kind of finding a definition is somewhat elusive, not completely elusive, but we've spent an hour and 10 minutes kind of talking, saying it's this, but it's not that, and it's this, but not too much of this. How can we begin to grasp what it is when it's so difficult to define? What are the ways that we can do that?
Well, maybe we're going to have to just recognize that it's going to be an ongoing event of trying to define it and recognize it. It's sort of like reverence. What is reverence? I think some of these things are more difficult and more elusive than we're going to be able to just solve them. And it's not so much about solving it. It's about moving in the right direction, and staying engaged with it and not simply resorting to the norms of our culture.
Yeah. So in terms of, so would you suggest then copying those that are good, solid, sound preachers, like copying what Luther did, copying or seeking to, imitate them?
Yeah, that's the only way you really are going to learn. Again, it's bizarre to me that homiletics 1, at our seminaries, and I'm not blaming I realize that, these are long traditions and academic accreditation and so forth, but it's insane to me that the way we teach homiletics is we tell guys they got to write their own sermons, from scratch. Can you imagine if you're in an English program and English 101, write a novel. So it's, I think imitation, we should be doing that deliberately. I still do it. I think it's totally worthwhile to just cut and paste a paragraph out of Luther that's really great and just edit it, and to make it your own and just work through it. And footnote it, of course, but I think there's all sorts of great stuff out there and we ought to be making use of it. I think seems to me that's the way that all art is learned, is by imitation, not by creativity. So I think that's the place to start always.
So one final thing, what kind of review process should we go through on our sermons? And, in terms of, taking stock where we're at, what after each one or every so often? Should we send it to a buddy and say, hey, what did I hit? What did I miss? What could be better?
Yeah, this is really a good question, and I do not have a good answer. There is no other kind of writing where we wouldn't have feedback and critique and editing and so forth. But it's really hard to pull off with sermons because I don't think it's a great idea, or I don't know how to do it in a way that's seems to me very useful to ask the actual audience to evaluate it. So it is a kind of difficult thing. I've struggled with this sort of mentally for a long time, and I haven't really figured out a way that I'm comfortable with, to where to get feedback. I mean, I have an advantage. There's another pastor here, Michael Fries. So, we can talk a little bit about stuff, but if I don't know, would you have an idea?
No,
I send your sermons to somebody.
Yeah. Every once in a while, I'll talk over not the actual sermon, but I will every once in a while call someone up and say, hey, this is the direction I'm thinking of going, and kind of just talk it out to see, does this make sense? But I've never done it like after the fact. Here's the recording, here's the manuscript, evaluate.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be a tough thing. It would have to be obviously somebody that you really trusted and respected, and and that would be hard for him then also to be as honest as you want him to be. So, yeah, I mean, we all went through homiletics and had the experience of being evaluated by our peers, and we all found it very easy to dismiss. Right.
Right.
I mean, we didn't care what our peers thought. At least I didn't, and I don't think the students around here do either. So it is a tough thing. At the same time, I mean, it is a need, and I don't know where to go for it.
Well, maybe that's why we always had the bishops visiting.
Well, yeah, wouldn't that be something? I mean, what a. But you got to have a bishop that you respect and admire and trust. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be the most ideal thing would be if a bishop like that showed up and then, gently said, okay, this was good, but this was, well, of course, the other thing we didn't talk about was this whole, the whole aspect of rhetoric, which is another thing that we need to work on and learn. And I do have a recommendation for a book there. I just found this book. It was only published a couple of years ago, called Ancient Rhetoric from Aristotle to Philostratus, edited by Thomas Habeneck. This is really a great book. Have you seen this, Jason?
I haven't. I've read a different book about the rhetoric and logic of the Bible. In the New Testament, I should say. But Winger refers to it in his Ephesians commentary, and so I just picked up the book because I was interested in rhetoric and argument, and to see how, and it comes up always in Jesus's preaching and things like that.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Well, I'm interested in that too, but I don't know about it. Well, this book, this Ancient Rhetoric from Aristotle to Philostratus, is really nice because he gives you an entire book of rhetoric where he just pulls out pieces from these different writings on rhetoric from the ancient world. So, of course, Cicero and Aristotle are in there, but because there's so much in those books, or that are really, there's a lot of overlap between them. So what you get is kind of a conflagration of all of them, or a condensation of all of them. And he introduces it too. He introduces each chapter and, show and so forth, but it's really kind of a nice way to get at what ancient rhetoric was, which was a very serious thing. And I think, again, that's something that I had no rhetorical training.
And nobody has.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, right? Unless, hopefully there's some kids now that are getting it. So maybe in 20 years we'll have
good preachers again.
Yeah. But I think, this is, these sorts of things were assumed. You would already have known this by the time you came to seminary.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing too is very useful. And of course, we're not talking here about being clever or being convincing, but simply of being clear and logical and thorough, right? And I like this definition of kind of finding the best argument for the case, sort of thing. And I think there's a lot to be said for that too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you get the sense from the Confessions, right, that repentance is making an argument in order to change one's mind.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, any final thoughts on what we've discussed here in terms of preaching, or any final encouragement that you might have?
Yeah, I mean, I know it might sound sort of daunting, all of this stuff, and it's been a lot of information and a lot of kind of exhortation to work harder. That I would say, though, that this is actually, for most of us, maybe all of us, our first love. And in some sense, I think we've gotten away from it, and getting back into it is really a joy. So I think, if you've gotten into the habit of using Logos for your sermon prep instead of using a physical Greek New Testament or whatever, and you go back to it, I think you might find it difficult for a little while, but it will be very rewarding. And your own, you will grow spiritually through these exercises, not only so that you're a better servant to your people, but also to yourself, and it'll be worth it.
Well, thanks for your time. I will have links for all of the books mentioned in the show notes, and look forward to having you on again.
Thank you, Jason.